Professor Sesay is an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department, where he has received an Excellence in Teaching Award from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. An historian of early America and religion, he has authored several book chapters, articles, book reviews, and blogs. His writing has appeared in the New England Quarterly and the Journal of African-American Studies. He has written for Black Perspectives, the blog of the African-American Intellectual Historical Society, and is on the editorial board for Black Perspectives. He is also a Revolutionary Spaces Scholar Fellow, participating in the fashioning of public history exhibits about Boston during the American Revolutionary Era. He is currently completing a book manuscript entitled Black Boston and the Making of African-American Freemasonry, Leadership, Religion, and Community in Early America. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Ruthie, thank you so much for that wonderful and inspired introduction. And I want to thank the Black Alumni Committee. I want to thank April Garrett in particular for all the time and effort that she's taken to organize this. And I also want to thank the Office of Alumni Relations. And I want to thank everybody who is in attendance today. The weather is beautiful outside. And so for those of you who are here, I am honored by your presence. So I've been invited to talk about Juneteenth, and I'm an historian. And so a lot of what I'm going to do is to place Juneteenth in kind of a broader history, or in fact, several different histories or historical contexts. And then I'll end with talking about kind of the broader symbolic significance of Juneteenth. So I want to begin just briefly by saying that I think it's obvious that June 19th, 1865 was not only a day of emancipation, it was also a day of reckoning. So on the one hand, you had an enslaved population learn that they were formally gaining freedom, that they were getting release from ownership, that they were being recognized not just as property, but now, in fact, as persons. And any property that they would own legally and have the full extent of the law to protect that property and their own personhood. And at the same time, this was a day of reckoning. Whites in the South were forced to relent in the tide of history. And so, yes, June 19th, 1865 was one particular day, one episode. And we should also remember, in fact, that it's a particular moment in a much longer struggle for freedom, and that its celebration is a very significant reminder that, in fact, our current struggles for freedom, for equality, for justice, not only are historical, but in fact are ongoing. And so I would like to talk about Juneteenth today in three particular ways. First, I want to talk about its importance in terms of contemporary or current conversations about American history. Second, I want to show how within a history of different freedom celebrations, Juneteenth has risen to national prominence. And then the last thing that I want to do is to argue that in fact we should continue to highlight the significance of Juneteenth. And so to go to my first point, to talk about the significance of Juneteenth in contemporary and current debate, I want to start off with a story. And so in preparation for this presentation, I was on the web, I was on YouTube, I was checking out how other scholars have talked about Juneteenth, and I was spending time watching some of the other presentations that you can find across the web. And I found one presentation This presentation, it's on YouTube. You can find it. It was given by Dr. Shanette Garrett Scott. It was given in June of 2013. And she gave a wonderful, wonderful talk. But I want to talk about one of the responses to her talk in terms of situating the significance of Juneteenth. And so, one of the things that makes this a significant episode is these general orders number 3, this announcement in Galveston, Texas, that the enslaved people there were in fact freed by the Union Army. And so, somebody asked about these general orders, and then it was interesting. There was a gentleman in the audience. From what I could tell, he looked white, and he said, in response to this wonderful lecture that Dr. Garrett Scott had given, he said, well, the thing of it was, and I'm paraphrasing, but nonetheless, there are some words that I'm using as within quotations that come from this person. So this man, again, he looked white, and he said, well, the issue with Juneteenth, the issue with this day of emancipation was that it brought about unemployment. He used that word, unemployment. It brought about unemployment and economic depression. And Dr. Garrett Scott was very diplomatic in her response to him, because she said, well, yes, the freeing of the enslaved people gaining their emancipation certainly caused economic disruption throughout the South. But then she went on to emphasize this moment of hope, this moment of justice, as I said earlier, this moment of reckoning. And so Juneteenth sits in between these two sides of interpretation, these two very different stories of how we understand American history. On the one side, the emancipation of the enslaved is seen as a problem of unemployment. Now, to be clear, somebody who does not own their own body and labor technically can never be unemployed because they aren't free. So the gentleman's response was problematic in all sorts of ways, but it did reflect a particular position on how we understand American history. In my understanding, the gentleman's response reflected an understanding of American history based in anti-Black racism, based in white supremacy, based in these deeply racist and paternalistic ideas that somehow people of African descent needed leadership, needed guidance, and that they should remain on the bottom of society. But on the other hand, there's this other interpretation. And this other interpretation talks about these long histories of freedom struggle on the part not just of indigenous people in the Americas, but of people of African descent. So here we have Juneteenth, this moment of emancipation, and these two competing interpretations. One that looks at this moment as creating more instability and chaos, and this other interpretation that sees this moment as a moment of reckoning, as a particular episode where all of the struggle that African Americans have taken towards being recognized as human beings is to at least a limited degree recognized by the national government. So I use that story to kind of begin in terms of talking about the stakes that are here for us in a discussion about Juneteenth. And so I want to move now to talk about Juneteenth in historical context. And here I'm going to actually move and share my screen with you, because I have a number of slides that illustrate some of the points that I'd like to make, so bear with me. And so to understand the history of Juneteenth in a very broad context, we should in fact start with this region, this place that we now call Texas. And we should consider the fact that, before Texas was Texas, before it was a part of Mexico, this was a place that was occupied by any number of indigenous groups. And so what I have for you on the screen just gives you a sense of the diversity that existed in this place prior to the arrival of various imperial powers. And so to jump forward then a little bit in history, we have these 13 colonies. And, one of the things that I want us to keep in mind is that the United States were not what we think of them, right, as we're moving back in time. So when we go back, we have this region that only at a certain point was called Texas. And here we have, in fact, the beginnings of America. And we have these colonies that all rebel against Great Britain to create the beginnings of the nation that we now all live in. And certainly this idea, these ideas about human rights and natural equality drove, at least in part, this break from Great Britain. And it's also these ideas about human equality and about natural rights that are that were underlying the Civil War, and that have provided inspiration for various freedom struggles for African Americans and people of African descent. And so here we see the expansion, in fact, from those original 13 English colonies across the United States. Now, when we begin to think about Texas, right, at a certain point in time, and you can kind of see this on this map, it was a part of Spanish possessions. And so before in fact there was Mexico, you had this land that was occupied by indigenous people. And so Mexico gains its independence from Spain in 1821. And this is part of colonial conquest that played out between the Spanish, the French, and even the English. In 1824, Mexico forms its own constitution. And as part of the formation of Mexico, you had the creation of a Mexican state called Texas. In 1836, Texas declares itself an independent republic, and that lasts until 1845, at which point in time Texas is annexed by the United States. And so Texas, in fact, is formally enters into the United States at the very beginning of 1846. And this annexation leads to the Mexican-American War. Mexico never recognized this annexation, and so you have this conflict that arises because of it. But nonetheless, Texas becomes a part of the Confederate states, or the broad Confederacy, forgive me. And so Texas enters the Union as a slave state, And so one of the things that you can see, that I'll show you on a little map going forward, is that after the American Revolution, we get this split between those states that have freed their enslaved populations and those states where slavery, in fact, expands. And so we have to remember, again, the westward expansion of this growing American nation, the annexation of Texas, and the fact that when Texas enters into the Union, it enters as a slave state. And so we also have to remember that even though there are some states that freed their enslaved populations after the American Revolution, there's a broad national compromise. And that compromise is reflected in the 3/5 clause of the United States Constitution. In order to maintain the stability and coherence of the nation at the legislative level, an agreement was made essentially between the northern states and the southern states. And so even though northern states had freed their enslaved populations, they essentially agreed to the expansion of slavery in the southern states. Not only that, but the northern states allowed for a political compromise whereby the enslaved persons in the southern states, although not given freedom, would act and left without the ability to vote, would nonetheless be recognized in terms of political representation. So as a consequence of that, those owned people in the southern states are recognized for political legislative purposes, but they, again, are not allowed to vote, and slavery is allowed to expand in the context of the United States. And so in this map, you see, this data comes from the 1860 federal census. And I'll zoom in, but this basically shows you to kind of the lower left, this territory of Texas, and the darkest regions throughout this map of the South show those places that had the largest concentrations of enslaved people. I'll move forward, and here you can see kind of the inset of this region of Texas, the state of Texas, and you can begin to see the concentrations of enslaved people that were in Texas. And you should be able to discern a little yellow circle, and within the middle of that circle is the island of Galveston, where the events of June 19th, 1865 took place. And within that circle, you can't really see it, read it from the screen, but Harris County. So just if you start at Galveston Island and jog north just a little bit, but you're still in the harbor, it's Harris County where you have Houston. So Houston today is probably about 70 miles northwest of the island of Galveston. And this will become important for us, our conversation a little later on. So this gives you a sense of geography. It also gives you a sense of where the densest populations of enslaved people were in Texas on the eve of the Civil War. And so on the eve of the Civil War, the total population of Texas numbered approximately 2,432, and approximately 30% of that total were enslaved people. And so even though June 19th, 1865 is this moment of emancipation, we should also remember that throughout the settlement and establishment and annexation of Texas, enslaved people were running from their owners. In some cases, they were running kind of south and west to the frontier, or I'm sorry, the border with Mexico. In other cases, they were running away west to the kind of western frontier to establish, in fact, their own kinds of maroon communities. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the idea of maroon communities, these were groups of people of African descent who had, throughout the Americas, this practice consisted of people essentially running away from their enslavers and creating communities of runaways in places that were formerly or isolated, at least to some degree, so that they could create communities of various runaway people. And this is really important because, again, it reminds us, right, that the struggle for freedom can't be encapsulated in one particular day, even though that day is important. But moreover, that day reminds us of a very long struggle. And so, going forward, then, I want to talk a little bit, I want to move away from talking about this kind of broad history of Texas to talking more specifically about Texas in the context of the Civil War. And so on June 19th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln, who you see here, approved legislation banning slavery in the territories. Now, we have to remember that the Civil War starts in 1861. In the middle of 1862, before Lincoln gives, or I should say as part of Lincoln giving his Emancipation Proclamation, he says that slavery is banned in the federal territories. Now, this was a very big deal because just about 5 years earlier, we had the Dred Scott decision. So Dred Sam Scott and his family in 1846 sue for their freedom. This court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And as a part of that decision, the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney described Black people as, quote, beings of an inferior order. And his decision did many things. It stated that Black people were not citizens of the United States. It said that Black people could not bring a legal suit against anybody. They didn't have legal rights. And it also said that Congress at the federal level could not limit the expansion of slavery into Western states and territories. So when Lincoln says that slavery is banned in federal territories, and then when he gives his famous Emancipation Proclamation, we see this buildup of tensions between the North and the South with respect to the expansion of slavery. And so we have to remember, slavery lies at the heart of the Civil War, but also, and in a slightly different way, the expansion of slavery was also important, and it wasn't necessarily the same thing as slavery in and of itself. Because again, we have to remember that, for example, the three-fifths clause in the Constitution allowed for a national compromise on the question of slavery. But as these 13 original colonies begin to expand in conflict with indigenous people and with the Spanish and the French, as the United States begin to bring more states into this union, it is the expansion of slavery that creates these growing political conflicts between the North and the South. And so here you see part of an excerpt from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And so this is enacted in 1863. Many of you know already that while this proclamation was important in many ways, it did not formally end slavery in the South, but it was in fact a strategic statement that Lincoln hoped would help turn the tide of battle in favor of the North. And one of the things that Lincoln hoped would happen is that news and rumor of this Emancipation Proclamation would spread throughout the South, and that it would become a mechanism, a means for inspiring the enslaved to leave their owners and in fact to join Union forces. And in fact, that does happen. And so again, even in the context of the Civil War, right? Remember, freedom struggles are part of a very long history. And the Emancipation Proclamation, as important as it is yet one moment, only one moment in this larger history of freedom struggles. And so this then brings us to the events of June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army with his troops delivers General Orders number 3. And really, these General Orders are pretty significant in terms of their language, right? This idea that there would be, quote unquote, absolute equality between people who were formally owned and the people who formally owned them. Yes, this, at least rhetorically, is a complete upheaval of power relationships in the South. I use the word rhetorical because all sorts of things happen in response to the North winning the war. But nonetheless, this moment, this news of freedom is very important for the people of Galveston. And so we also have to remember some other important dates. So the 14th, the 13th Amendment is passed on January 31st, 1865. So it's passed just a few months more or before the General Orders number 3 are given in Galveston. After June 19th, 1865, we have in 1868 the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship to all persons. And then 2 years later, in 1870, we have the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gives all men, and this is an important point because it doesn't give women the right to vote, but it does give all men, including Black men, the right to vote. Another important point about the consequences, or I should say the results of the 15th Amendment, is that for a time, even though it's only Black men who have the rights to vote, there are any number of instances throughout the South where women play extremely prominent roles in public conversations and debates about who the Black community as a whole will support as its representatives to the various Southern governments. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in some ways also reflected the Military Reconstruction Acts. So these are acts passed in 1867 and 1868 that essentially allowed for the North to occupy the South to ensure that African Americans would in fact be able to exercise their ability to vote, their powers to hold office, and their abilities to own property, build wealth, and begin to create various kinds of institutions and associations, okay? And so in addition, then, it's important to remember that the Civil War didn't end all at once. The Civil War ends kind of in fits and starts and in different places. And this is really important because in the history of Juneteenth, one of the things that happens is that those people who celebrated Juneteenth in the 20th century, in some cases, would be teased by people from the West or people Black people from the West or Black people from the North. And the joke would essentially go, why are you celebrating being the last to know about emancipation? And that joke is really problematic, again, because emancipation happened in a very uneven way throughout the South. So it's important to remember that even though there is this time lag between the formal ending of the Civil War at Appomattox in 1865, and the time at which various regions of the South were occupied by Union forces, there was no one particular moment where all of a sudden all Black people throughout the South were free. And so even before June 19th, 1865, Black people in Galveston knew that through news and through rumor, because if you remember the map that I showed you earlier, Galveston was a fairly important seaport. All sorts of news traveled through that particular area. And so the enslaved there, they weren't making a big deal of knowing that it seemed as though the South was losing the war. But they in fact did know this and anticipated that at some point Union troops would actually arrive and establish themselves physically in Galveston. And so they only, in some ways, June 19th, 1865 was just this kind of particular moment that formalized what many of the enslaved in Galveston already knew. This is a pencil drawing from Edwin Forbes. This was a photographer and artist from the North who traveled to the South to document the Civil War. The title of this, in fact, was Contrabands Escaping. So the word contraband means, kind of spoils of war or things that are owned. And so one of the things that he drew, in fact, were enslaved people who were leaving their owners, trying to go to what became freedmen's communities, or trying to, in many cases, make it to places that were occupied by Union troops, where their protection could be assured. Here you have an example from Harper's Weekly of in a public forum the recognition that African Americans themselves fought in the Civil War. And this is another important point, because one way to think of Juneteenth is that, freedom was brought to the enslaved. But if we think about the service of African Americans, both the formal and informal service of African Americans on the side of Union troops, we have to remember that it's important to think about June 19th as part of the efforts of African Americans themselves to gain freedom. And so moving forward from the Civil War are all sorts of very important stories about the emergence of public life. If you think back to the map that I showed you earlier of the concentrations of enslaved people along the Texas coast, there's an important story to be told. And so in this photograph, to the far left of the photograph is Reverend John Henry Yates, or he's also called Jack Yates. He was originally born in Virginia in 1828. At a certain point in time, he and his wife was also enslaved, were moved with their owners to Matagorda County, Texas. And so Matagorda County, Texas is just kind of below Harris County where Houston is, and not too far from Galveston. So at the end of the Civil War, the Yates family, actually they leave their owners and they go to Houston. And this is important because in Galveston, not only did you have the establishment of important Black communities there, but you also had at least 1,000 Black people who all move inward to the city of Houston at the end of the Civil War. And so also in this picture, before I move on, kind of in the center, the woman dressed in Black, kind of in the second row above the woman sitting, that was the wife of Jack Yates. And so they move to Houston. This is a more contemporary map, but if you look to the kind of southwest corner of this map, you'll see the Fourth Ward. It's now an historic ward. So Houston was founded in 1836. It was incorporated in 1839. In 2008, the city stopped using these wards as political districts, but nonetheless, these districts became formally historic districts. And so it's the Fourth Ward that historically has been the Black ward. And it's in the Fourth Ward where you had the establishment of what were called the Freedmen's community. So many African Americans from Galveston and other adjacent places in the area all traveled and kind of amassed in the Fourth Ward. When they first arrived to the Fourth Ward, we were talking about land that was, for the most part, underdeveloped and undesirable because it was swampland. So African Americans essentially settled there and began, in fact, to build it up. Jack Yates and his family were leaders in the establishment of the Freedmen's community there in the Fourth Ward. And by the 1920s, the Fourth Ward had Houston's highest population density. And the history of Houston's Fourth Ward should remind us of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in fact, the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, race massacre, just passed. And so the Fourth Ward in Greenwood, in many ways, are comparable. These are both places where many African Americans congregated after the Civil War. They pooled their resources and they began to create all sorts of associations and institutions that comprised this vibrant public life. Yates helped build a Baptist church in the Fourth Ward. And when we're talking about the development of this vibrant Black public life, we're talking not just about churches, but we're also talking about fraternal and sororal associations. We're talking about schools. We're talking about insurance societies, benevolence societies, people organizing to create Black cemeteries, and Black people are organizing to create Black parks. And Black parks and all of this associational life is really important because it expands during what scholars call the period of Reconstruction. So from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to approximately the end of the 1870s, Northern military occupation of the Southern states allows Black life to flourish. Now, it is true that also during this period, African Americans continued to experience all sorts of oppression and violence from whites, But nonetheless, the military occupation of Northern troops allows African Americans to create this vibrant public life. And it's within this vibrant public life that we begin to get these huge public celebrations of what was then called Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day. It's really only in kind of the early to mid 20th century that this term Juneteenth becomes more popularized. This is a cottage that has been historically preserved from the Fourth Ward. This is a relatively recent photo. And I've put this PowerPoint up because it reflects back to the American Revolution, and it also allows, in some ways, a kind of segue for me to move towards my second point, and that is to think about these Juneteenth in the context of this longer history of Freedom Day celebrations. So just to review briefly, it's important to remember that during this period of Reconstruction, we get this public emergence of all sorts of celebrations and remembrances of emancipation. And we can take Jubilee Day or Emancipation Day and think of them in a long history of various kinds of Freedom Day celebrations. And so as a consequence of the American Revolution, Black people in the northern states pointed out the hypocrisy of whites who argued that they were being enslaved by Great Britain, while in fact, those same whites enslaved their African neighbors. And so one of the things that happens is Black people's forcing this question of their enslavement and demonstrating the hypocrisy of these northern states. This at least is part of the story behind why the northern states freed their enslaved populations. It's also true that the northern states freed their enslaved populations because they could afford to do so. Slavery was not an ensconced part of these northern economies in the same way that it was for these southern economies. So what this means is that by the 1830s, you essentially have a generation of African Americans in the North who now are the sons and daughters of the Black revolutionaries who actually fought in the American Revolution. And so what you see here is a page from a Philadelphia newspaper. By the 1830s, Pennsylvania had freed most of its enslaved population. It's in Philadelphia, in fact, where you had the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church by Richard Allen. And what you see here, it's a little hard to make out, but you had first and second generation kind of post-American Revolution African Americans who would have what they called artillery days or military days, where they would actually put on the gear that they or their fathers wore during the American Revolution, and they would march publicly. And so these were public celebrations of the freedom that they themselves had fought for during the American Revolution. And ironically, or not really ironically, but we can see how they are being made fun of in this public newspaper. And so this reminds us of the complexity of American history and these competing stories. These, on the one hand, is this narrative of freedom struggles and of various moments of emancipation, and these competing narratives of these reactions and responses against the emancipation and the freedom of African Americans. This is a certificate from the American Colonization Society. Again, this was a response to the freeing of Black people in the northern states. Despite Black people gaining freedom, you did have this movement, and it's a complex movement. I don't have time to talk more about it here, but it is a movement where whites in the North and the South, for different reasons, had hoped to transport freed Black people to Africa while keeping enslaved Black people here in America. And so, again, in terms of this history of freedom struggles, Absalom Jones, who, along with Richard Allen, at least helped partially to form the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he gave this published sermon. He called it a Thanksgiving sermon, and he published it January 1st, 1808, and it was meant to celebrate the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, it's also important to admit that part of the reason why North America, the North American states ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 was, on the one hand, you had Northerners who were against it on for ideological reasons, but at the same time, you had Southerners who were increasingly wary of the transatlantic slave trade because they had populations of enslaved that had become self-reproducing. And so they no longer needed to import slaves from West Africa. And there were whites throughout the South who were becoming increasingly fearful of, in some places, growing populations of African slaves, populations of African slaves that in some cases were larger than the populations of whites. And so, for example, on the eve of the Civil War in South Carolina, for example, within that state, Black people comprised approximately 60% of that state's population. But again, this is an example of a kind of a Freedom Day celebration. And there are other examples that I could give of Freedom Day celebrations going forward. And there are also examples of Freedom Day celebrations that have begun not just by African Americans. So, for example, we have July 4th. But this brings us essentially to my last question. Within a history of Freedom Day celebrations, why does Juneteenth stand out? And there are a whole variety of reasons for that. I'll give a few, and then I'll shortly move to a close. So Annette Gordon Reed, an eminent historian of Thomas Jefferson, has a very recent book out. I think it's a 2020 book on Juneteenth. And she's from Texas. And so her book is this kind of a memoir, a historical memoir about what Juneteenth means to her, while also historicizing this local celebration. And one of the things that she says in that book is that, for her parents and her grandparents in particular, really, her grandparents were people who were not that far removed from the days of slavery. And so for her grandparents, the celebration of June 19th meant much more on a personal note than did a celebration, for example, of July 4th. So I think that's one reason why June 19th stands out, at least for local populations and families from Galveston and from Texas. I also think that June 19th, 1865 stands out for some other reasons. So really quickly to kind of backtrack, after the period of Reconstruction, the public celebrations of Juneteenth that I had talked about contract. When the North leaves the South, you get the rise of Black lynchings. You get the emergence of Jim Crow violence and segregation. During World War II, you also get the rise of nativism. And for all these reasons, kind of African-American public celebrations become these moments of drawing attention to Black people. So you get this contraction of kind of Black public celebration. But other things happen. You get the migration of Black people from the South to the North, and they bring their customs, their traditions, their rituals with them. You also then get the formal civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, where various celebrations, Juneteenth being one of them, get taken up in a broader African-American culture of tradition and of Freedom Day celebration. And just before, or I should say, just at the very end of the 20th century, you in fact had various groups from the South in particular who really organized themselves to push to make Juneteenth not just a local celebration, but a national celebration. And a national celebration that wouldn't just be a celebration of Texas history, but that would use this particular day in the history of Texas as a platform and as a reminder for future movements for equality, democracy, and justice. And so it's this last point that I want to end on. I think it's important to emphasize the significance of Juneteenth going forward, and in fact, the importance of advocating that Juneteenth become a national holiday. It has established its place in this long history of African-American freedom struggle. And it becomes an important reminder, not just of local history, but also a reminder of this very long history of Black freedom struggle. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop there and hopefully we'll have some time for a few questions.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, if there are any questions, we do have a few minutes. Feel free to put those questions in the chat. Again, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. It was very enlightening, a great presentation. And I also just want to remind attendees that if you would like more information about upcoming alumni events, please check out alumni.depaul.edu. And you can see our calendar of upcoming events. If anyone would like any further information about the Black Alumni Chapter, you can feel free and email me. I'll drop my email address in the chat there. At agarrett@depaul.edu. Looks like we do have one question. I just saw 1 hour ago that a national Juneteenth holiday passed the Senate, I think. I know one passed in the state of Illinois for public services anyway. Yeah. Professor, do you have any thoughts on the likelihood of that passing in the Senate? Do you think?
No, I think there's a lot of momentum. As one of the attendees points out, there are, I'm forgetting the specific number, but a high number of states who have passed their own legislation commemorating Juneteenth. And I'm forgetting the kind of the state of that legislation in the Senate. I'm not sure if I would argue that it's likely to happen, but I do think there's a lot of momentum for it to happen in terms of becoming a national holiday. Oh, an hour ago. Oh, so this is recent news. Okay.
Oh, well, we missed it.
Okay. Voter suppression laws. So, wait, slavery is now, slavery in the air did not begin at least 100 years before 1619. How did this long history of slavery play a role in Juneteenth? Okay, so a bunch of questions here. And so since we're short on time, I'll try to be quick. I would hope that Juneteenth becoming a national holiday would positively impact conversations about reparations, but I think it's also the case that conversations about reparations are happening at multiple levels. And for anything to be passed at the national level, I think would be fairly complicated. Voter suppression laws. So there's kind of two short answers to that question. Historically speaking, by the time we get to the 1920s, all of the rights that African-American men had to vote throughout the South have been taken away, again, because of the Northern forces leaving. I think the current moves in voter suppression laws are part of this very long history and constant struggle of African Americans gaining some degree of political traction and then that being taken away. And this gets at this broader question about, various political and activist approaches to thinking about American history. Is American history progressive in some sense, or is it only a history of these continual circles back? I think that Juneteenth should be remembered in terms of progressions. And I am fairly cynical about American history, but I also think that movement obviously does not come without struggle, and struggle requires hope and motivation. And Juneteenth, I think, is part of that hope and motivation. Slavery in Texas begins so I kind of touched on this when I talked about indigenous groups. This is a huge question. Indigenous groups enslaved each other. Indigenous groups enslaved Africans. Indigenous groups, in some cases, also aligned and coalesced with escaped Africans. So there's a lot of history there that to unpack. And again, Juneteenth allows us to begin to have this conversation about all of this complexity that gets either overlooked or completely erased in most mainstream understandings of American history. Okay, short answers to great questions.
Thank you. We do appreciate it. I know it was a lot to fit in there. So I would also ask, if there were any additional questions that didn't get answered, you can feel free to email me, and I will pass on to Professor Sesay to to get back to you. But thank you all for attending. It was a wonderful event. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, the Black Alumni Chapter and all the attendees. And everyone have a good night.